Thank you all for making the time to be here today. I'm Mark Marie with Americans for Prosperity. We are here to discuss the importance of American energy abundance and learn a little bit more about what policymakers in Congress are doing to support ample supply of American energy and bring down energy prices for all consumers. I should say thank you to our host, Steptoe and Johnson, PLLC, for giving us this wonderful forum today. I should also say that this is part of Americans for Prosperity's Prosperity is Possible campaign, which kicked off earlier this month. We have with us today Congresswoman Carol Miller and Congressman Brad Wenstrup. Congresswoman Miller represents West Virginia's 1st Congressional District. She serves on the Ways and Means Committee, and she has been a leader in supporting West Virginia's energy industries. Before joining Congress in 2018, Congresswoman Miller served in the West Virginia House of Delegates, where she rose to become the first female majority whip. Congressman Wenstrup represents Ohio's 2nd Congressional District. He also serves on the Ways and Means Committee. He served in Congress since 2013, and in that time he's been a leader in the Ohio delegation in supporting policies for American energy abundance and independence. In addition to serving in Congress for the past 10 years, he's a medical doctor and a veteran. So thank you for your service. From Pennsylvania, first in the crowd, we have Jill Burke from the office of Representative Mike Kelly. On the panel, we have John Gallo, the Executive Director of the American Oil and Gas Alliance. He brings an extensive knowledge of the midstream and distribution sector and is an industry leader in the Marcellus region. And he has a passion for the energy industry and for the nation. Briefly, I am, again, Mark Marie. I am a Regulatory Policy Fellow at Americans for Prosperity, where I focus on energy policy. I'd like to start by allowing each of our speakers to say a few brief remarks. First, Congressman Miller.
Well, thank you so much for orchestrating this today. And I must say, I am so happy to have Brad here. He's a lot cooler than I am. He's been in Congress longer. We are on the same Ways and Means Committee. I am thrilled. I spent 12 years in our state house working towards energy because West Virginia, of course, considers themselves an energy state. But then when you really look at the region, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia are all the same people working with the same natural resources and have. I've been very disturbed, particularly with this administration, on what has occurred trying to derail our energy dominance. Within the first week, we got rid of the Keystone Pipeline. We have done more and more regulatory damage through the bureaucratic network and through the administration that, of course, drives everybody's prices up. And why in the world we would ever be using our national reserve blows my mind, because we have the abundance of so many wonderful natural resources. And so I'm not going to say any more. I think we can just lead off from there.
Excellent. You want? Congressman Wenstrup.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Carol. That was a good summary, and pleasure to be with you. I represent Ohio's 2nd District, and I have for the last 10 years, but the district changed tremendously. I went from being in 8 counties, where 5 of them were full counties, that now I'm in 16 counties and 15 of them are full. So we really went east, so really all the way from Cincinnati then to West Virginia. So I'm glad to be here. And it's been a pleasure to get to work with Carol. I've been on Ways and Means Committee for a couple terms now, and I was on Ways and Means and Intelligence, and still am. And those are 2 committees where there's no freshmen. And so don't always get to meet everyone as well as you'd like to. So now Carol's on Ways and Means, and we have come together and really, worked well together. And I don't think there's much more to say that we won't get into in the general discussion. Why these things are important to us personally and for our districts and for the country. But there's a lot of things that have started to take place We had energy independence. We want that back. And there's just a lot of opportunities for us within the government to work with the private sector and to work for the private sector so that we can deliver more for the American people. And when you talk about energy and doing things to make us energy independent, and then it gets into all forms of domestic production that's important for America. We'll probably talk a little bit about our supply chain today, the opportunities that we have. And you talked about the resources that we have. We have minerals in this country. We have energy in this country. I like to look at it as we learned growing up, God shed his grace on thee. And we have so much in this country, there's no reason that we need to be dependent on other countries. And we've put ourselves in that position, unfortunately, and we need to turn that around. Thank you.
Thank you. John?
I'm supposed to follow that. Hi, everybody. I'm John Gallo. I'm here as an industry professional. So this industry is important to me because it's one of the few things that I've been really good at in my life. When I started way back when, I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. I had no real path. And I started as a laborer, ended up being in a ditch shoveling snow for about 4 days straight, and I knew 3 days in this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life. But this industry has allowed me to provide for my family. It's allowed me to progress as an individual. It's allowed me to learn a lot of things. And then ultimately I'm here because I started a nonprofit advocacy group for oil and gas sustainability in America. But that's not just our, oil and gas doesn't just provide us energy. Oil and gas provides us daily life. It's been a direct reason for the industrial age. The reason we're in this room and we have these microphones and we're able to talk about this is because of the relationship of oil and gas. And I personally wanted to join that fight with folks like you guys. So I'm honored to be here, and I'm very happy to be on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that framing, I'd love to jump into some questions for our panelists. And I should say that we are also joined by, a great array of national, regional, and local business leaders, including from kind of energy-related business associations. And we will be opening it up at the end for questions. So for folks joining online, make sure you stick around. But I want to start with questions for our esteemed panel. Energy costs have increased substantially under this administration. The administration is giving kind of shifting explanations, blaming the war in Ukraine, blaming energy companies. There hasn't really been any self-reflection, though, among the administration about its own kind of regulatory permitting policies. I'd like to ask each of you in turn, what do you make of that, and what do you see as having driven energy prices over the past few years, and as the drivers in the next few years going forward?
Well, what they've done is they have provided more and more regulation and ways to kill the industry. When they can bankrupt you by keeping things in the court and going on time after time legally, it's a good way to kill whatever you're doing. I remember back even 12 years ago, and this is before this administration, when in West Virginia we took a 270-page bill for Marcellus Shale and took it down to 70 pages just to put the framework in, because they will over-regulate you to the point where it's extremely difficult to do business, and it costs so much money in the beginning to even start whatever project you're doing that that has been a major way that they have hamstrung the industry.
Yeah, if I can add to that, let's not beat around the bush. The policies are to blame, for the problems that we are having when it comes to the high prices. And we start to squeeze our market. Canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, making it difficult for the oil and gas leases and on the federal lands, and the environmental regulations, and lawsuits when you try to conduct a project, and this rush to green agenda is really killer, and it's not looking at the big picture. So these policies are just damaging in so many ways, but it's not just what happens at the oil and gas level, it's everything that follows from that. I've always been for all of the above. I drive a hybrid, it makes some sense. It works out well. At home, build a pole barn. I didn't run it into the grid because that would have been another meter and everything else because it's across the street. I put a solar panel on it and use batteries because I don't need to have the lights on there very much. So we can be smart about how we do things. But this rush to green agenda, it's so concerning from a national security standpoint, because then we're relying on others, relying on China. China gets rich on all of this. When you talk about electric cars, hey, that's great if you think so, but do we really want Americans dependent on China for their transportation? Because we can't make the batteries. We don't make them. I mean, all of these things, run together, and we start to see blackouts. And they want to talk about, the effect of the environment on our health. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm a physician. Go into a hospital. What happens when you don't have power? When you have a blackout? Well, one, you run fossil fuels through your generators. That's how you do it. So we have to continue to take this all of the above approach if we are going to be a safe and healthy and secure society. And the policies they're putting in place are hurting us in every aspect of life, not just at that core component of where our energy actually comes from.
But that all of the above is letting the market determine where and how we should move forward. And I've joked since I've been in Congress, I wish I had a degree in chemistry, a degree in physics. So many scientific discoveries continue to be made every single day. You talk about that hospital, how could you do surgery without some of the plastic and some of the incredible things that are made from oil and gas, that we won't even talk about our clothing, but there are so many things that are directly affected by these policies that are in everyday life. I have joked, what if when Henry Ford finally got his model through and had a production line, what if Congress came and said, now y'all, everybody has to buy a car. You can no longer ride a horse, you can't use your oxen, you can't use a mule, you have to do this. That's what we tend to do in Washington, is we make these mandates on where we should be instead of letting the market. I mean, we're all in cars and trucks now, but let the market determine. Let the entrepreneurship of America do what it does so well.
And I'd like to share something just right here off the top that people should keep in mind. And I try to remind our members on the Ways and Means Committee of this. They always talk about follow the science, and the science is there, and climate change. So the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration just issued a report late last year, 40-year study looking at pollution and over the Atlantic Ocean and over the Pacific Ocean. And what the results may surprise you. And I'll preface it by saying this: as a physician, I could write a medication that might kill the virus or bacteria in you, but if I kill you too, I really haven't helped you, have I? And so can't we be smart? As a physician, I recommend when you're going to be out in the sun, put on some sunscreen because I don't want you getting skin cancer. But at the same time, a little sun's good because it gives you the vitamin D that you need.
Right.
All right, so this study, look, we talk about global warming, and you talk about the drought and fires and hurricanes and storms. So over the Pacific Ocean, or let's start with the Atlantic. Over the Atlantic Ocean, pollution has gone down. Why? Because we have done a tremendous job in North America to reduce our pollution.
626 million tons.
So we reduce it here, it's cleaner air over the ocean. That means there's less particulate matter between the sun and the earth. So what they have found is in the Atlantic Ocean, because there's more heat, more energy coming to the ocean, that is the energy for hurricanes and storms. And they have increased over the Atlantic Ocean. Over the Pacific, where there's more pollution coming from Asia, etc., they've had fewer hurricanes and storms. So you'll hear every day, every time there's a hurricane, there's a storm. Oh, it's all because of the damage that we are doing around. But what this study says is we maybe done too much. And so scientifically, we should be looking at what is the right amount, what is the right process. So it flies in the face of what you've been hearing for the last 15, 20 years that may be doing more harm than good, and we need to consider the actual science. And again, this isn't me talking, this came from a federal agency.
But that won't be on the news, will it?
That won't be on the news.
That's right.
But you heard me talk about it in committee.
Yes.
And actually, someone from the other side said, maybe we should have these discussions a little bit more in depth when the cameras aren't rolling.
Well,
for
I spent
example.
4 years on the Climate Crisis Committee. The discussions were very tilted the other way. I am far more concerned about the plastic bottles in the ocean than I am CO2. We have, West Virginia and Pennsylvania are the number 1 and 2 hardwood states in the country because we have so many trees, and they do need that CO2. But we're doing wonderful things with carbon capture, etc. And you are exactly right. Our Earth, thank you, the Lord, for even having this beautiful Earth. It has been changing ever since it began.
Yeah.
And some years are hot and some are cold. You're the scientist. You know where there have been oceans where there are now deserts. We have changed. We will continue to change. And also the tilt of the Earth towards the sun does vary, and that is part of the whole equation. So I'm really glad you brought that out.
So, John, I want to kick it to you to get your perspective in a minute, but I think it is very important for everyone to understand. As the Congresswoman and Congressman have said, we've made so much environmental progress in this country in the past 50 years. Particulate matter here in the United States, those levels are much lower than what you see in Europe. To the extent that they do spike from time to time, it's due to things like, in many instances, forest fires, as we saw on the East Coast, the forest fires coming from Quebec just a couple weeks ago, and also, frequently in the West, where you have environmental policies such as NEPA, which make it difficult to manage the forest, to clear the underbrush. And so when there is a fire, consequently ends up being much, much larger. So we've made a lot of progress. Much of it is due to the natural gas industry over the past, 10, 20, 30 years. And in some ways, we're being held back by some of our environmental regulations, and permitting requirements. So John, I want to kick it to you just to get your perspective from industry, from the ground up, what you see as really being the impediments to energy abundance over the past few years, and as you look forward, the barriers going forward.
Yeah. So to touch on a couple of points there, first of all, I think everybody needs to understand that energy security does mean national security.
Absolutely.
Without the ability of energy, you don't have the ability to be secure. And an interesting fact is, I believe the DoD, Department of Defense, about 70% of their energy comes from oil and gas. So that's just a little tidbit to think about there. But from a policy standpoint, I think it's very clear that the policies have impacted, for lack of better words, they've screwed everything up. And I think that the American people are paying too much for energy, and it's very unnecessary. You brought up a couple points on the CO2 emissions. Just to elaborate on that a little bit, since 2000, the U.S. has reduced its emissions by 626 million tons year over year, which is 4 times more than number 2, which is the UK. And coincidentally, they rely on 80% of their energy that comes from oil and gas. So we have made significant strides as a nation and as a people, and as you've stated, the majority of that comes from natural gas, from the switch to natural gas, because it is cleaner, it is abundant, it is safer, and it's 41% cleaner than everywhere in the entire world, up to 41%. So producing here is economically responsible.
Such a valuable perspective. So we have this forced energy transition. And that's the official policy of this administration. They say it's an all-government policy. They're using all agencies, all levers at their disposal to force this transition. And the last Congress was really on board with that. Now, this Congress is a little bit different. We have a switch in the party that controls the House of Representatives. And in its first 100 days of this Congress, the House really worked at an incredible pace, an incredibly, I think, transparent way to pass a very ambitious bill, the Lower Energy Costs Act. It cuts through the red tape hampering not just the production of affordable energy, but really the red tape that I think someone said hamstrings it at every point in the supply chain. It eliminated a natural gas tax that had just been created by the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's just a small sampling of the really positive policies in this extremely ambitious bill. I just wanted to ask, first of all, from the representatives, from your perspectives, what are some of the, if you could say one or two most important provisions or aspects of the Lower Energy Costs Act?
I'll take that first if you want. First of all, when they say whole of government, it's not whole of government right now because the House of Representatives has a different stance.
I stand corrected.
No, you were right. It is. That's their attitude. Yeah. It's a whole of government. They're using certainly all the agencies, but we are trying to bring some reason to the equation. So, HR 1, the Lower Energy Costs Act, what we're trying to do is boost American energy production here domestically, and that includes going to the critical minerals and things that we need across America, allow us to mine and to harvest from our own land, and decrease our reliance on adversaries, which what their green energy policies do just the opposite. So permitting reform is probably one of the biggest things that we can do. And I'm sure John gets that from the get-go. And again, what we're trying to do is have the government work for you. That doesn't mean that we just want anything to happen, that we don't want safety standards, that we don't want to be just letting things out of control. But permitting reform has got to take place because the time we waste on so many things is really hurting and hampering every industry across America, including the environmental regulations that come through. Sometimes it's frivolous lawsuits that hold us back from moving forward, and the lawsuits were just intended to delay, not because they have some legitimate purpose. It's on behalf of all mankind. So I think that the permitting reforms and working to rein in the regulations are the biggest part of this in the near term. Carol?
And he said that very well. One of the other things that we as a party are really working on is NEPA reform. There are 229 major fossil fuel projects that are being held hostage right now. $167 billion worth. There's 42 mining projects. One of the things that I think is interesting is how we can have the analysis of permits. Instead of it taking 5 years, it's going to be a 2-year if we can get our legislation through. That would have 1 year of just analysis, and then the second year would do the permitting. And there's just so many sections because government is layer upon layer, and I've always said government begets more government and begets more government, and gosh, then we'll make a committee to study that, and then we'll have a committee to study the study. And so if we can just pull back some of these regulations, the government is to protect you, it is to keep you safe, but where do we draw the line? So what we're having to do is just kind of cut it back. It's how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? You have to keep working to pull these regulations back.
In general, with all of our agencies, it's where have we come from? We started our country with 3 agencies, state, treasury, and more, and we've now put out all these agencies, and they don't act parental. Like they're not out trying to say, hey, the best way to do this, John, we think as experts would be to do it this way. No, they're always coming
Telling you
at
what
you.
way to do it.
You're guilty of something that they have to fix. That's just kind of the
Guilty.
general
Yeah.
premise that's the culture within our agencies. And it's a shame they're not here to say, let's make America the best, and these are some guidelines that we want you to follow. But another thing that's really important about the permitting reform and speeding it up, and what we have in this bill is that no more than 75 pages, when you are wanting to come out with something or with the permitting process, and you have to do it within a year. We just got through the infrastructure bill funding for the Brent Spence Bridge, in Cincinnati, huge bridge, I-75 from Michigan all the way down to Florida. It's a really important bridge. It's been in great need. I've heard about it long before I was ever in Congress, that this bridge needs to be replaced. That's fine. And so I worked on, for example, highlighting our infrastructure needs like our bridges, and honing in on what the needs are for our country, and was always been for this bridge. And then I got here on the radio, Wenstrup, you voted against the infrastructure bill.
Of course.
That's because there was a whole lot more than just infrastructure in it. Plus, it added like $529 billion to our debt, which I don't believe we need to do to get these projects done. And then lastly, we were advocating for reform on permitting, and it didn't get in. And the point I made to the group, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana region, about this is, here's the problem. Right now, the permitting takes on average 4.5 years. So you're not going to see this happen for some time. Secondly, a bigger part of that problem is, especially with inflation, every day we wait, the more it costs. Every day we wait,
Exactly.
the more it costs. And so this has its effect on labor, on materials, often leads to cancellation of projects, and that's why this is so important in this bill right now.
And that kind of brings up supply chain. I mean, it's like all these dominoes that are affecting where we go. And 2 years ago when you had to buy a 2x4, it's ridiculous, the cost of so many things. And we can get into trucking, but you hit that. What really is infrastructure? We didn't have just an infrastructure bill that dealt with bridges and roads and all of the important things, the dams. It's numerous. We just added all the green stuff that you were talking about, and it isn't as if you and I dislike. We want clean air, we want clean water, we want clean everything, but you have to be a little bit more specific when you're doing these things with what, 31, almost $32 trillion debt right now. And so, for instance, where I come from, Culloden has been on the books. For 20 years, it's been on the books to have an interchange there. See, our roads are not quite the same as in Ohio. And every year for 20 years, I've been checking, it's closer, it's closer, it's closer, it's closer. Now we have this huge hotel that's being built right there in Culloden, and the timing is perfect. But how many times that occurs, it's so rare.
Right.
Because often we have the knee-jerk reaction, well, we need to do this, we need to fix this. But that just came to my head when you were talking about it, is that is going to be one thing that's timed perfectly moving forward, and I am happy about that. But that bill was a real tough one. It was tough to vote for, and it was tough to vote against. But when you are fiscally conservative and you are so concerned with the amount of debt we have for our children and grandchildren, because all the bills are just chock full of that. But John, do you have anything you want to add?
Absolutely. Now, so to me, I think, one of the most important things about HR 1 to me is the ability to regain energy independence and energy security. Like you said, the bill brings permitting reform. It brings the regulation reform, but it's not just for oil and gas exploration. It's also for the minerals in the U.S. So it doesn't really matter what energy source that you support. You should support HR 1 because it's helping your energy source as well. And that's where I'm at. If you support energy, period, you should support HR 1 because it gives us that ability to produce here.
Yeah, and I think the point you're making, it's so it's so important for people to understand is that many of the barriers that have been erected, first in law and then in litigation through court decisions, to affordable energy projects, let's say oil and gas, have now been extended to minerals and other parts of the green supply chain, whether it is building a generation facility, wind or solar, or a transmission line, or mining those minerals out west that would go into, let's say, an electric vehicle battery. And so it does seem like an area that's ripe for bipartisan compromise. But I think to Congresswoman Miller's point, there seems to have been, up to this point, a real lack of focus. Last Congress, and now in the Senate, where they're not even taking up the Lower Energy Costs Act, and they're very much kind of behind the curve in terms of what they're going to do. The various kind of parts of the Senate are kind of in their own corners. I wanted to bring up, because it just happened, the debt ceiling deal, the authorization of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is a very large kind of project that's been in the works for about a decade now. That would bring natural gas supply from West Virginia and really from the entire Appalachian Basin to the Mid-Atlantic, where there's tremendous demand for this affordable, abundant resource. Like I said, it was authorized in the debt ceiling deal, but there's kind of a caveat to that maybe, John, you could explain, and I think this frames up why, as great as the Mountain Valley Pipeline is, the importance of comprehensive permitting reform and to push forward with that is just as important.
Yeah, so if you talk about permitting, there's everybody talks about the MVP, but there's a few different lines that were involved in that. You have the MVP, you have the ACP, and you have the MVP Southgate. The problem is ACP actually did get approval, but they spent so much money in litigation that they actually canceled, which was very significant. You now have the MVP Southgate, which is in limbo. They just filed for an extension, obviously, but no one knows how that's going to go. So you have the MVP that is, for all intents and purposes, going to be complete. But it highlights a different issue. You have a lot of people out there that are talking about, oh, well, the capacity is only at 35% now because of, it was a myth and it was this. The problem with that capacity is there's two things. One, it was based off of the completion of all three projects. It was not based off of just the MVP line. And when you have one that's canceled and one's in limbo, you can't run at full capacity. That's not a scandal. That's economics. And the other thing to highlight about capacity is there's a difference between full ability and where we operate. The majority of pipelines in the country only operate at about 60 to 65%. And to make that a simple comparison, if your vehicle you can drive 150 mile an hour in your vehicle. You don't drive 150 mile an hour everywhere. What would that do to your vehicle? It's not, your capacity isn't where you typically run. That's the ability to ramp up in times of true need. If there is, very hot temperatures or very cold temperatures, you can increase the production of that line to get that energy where it needs to be.
So much important information, and I think education needs to happen about energy supply chains. People think about, okay, you drill for natural gas or oil, or you mine for a mineral, and then something happens in the middle, and then it gets in my gas tank at the end. And I think, before COVID, frankly, people who didn't work in or directly related to supply chains maybe hadn't heard the word, didn't really know what it meant. But we've kind of been attuned to this idea that there's a supply chain for everything that you buy. And understanding and educating the public and policymakers, not present company, but other policymakers, because I know present company knows well the importance of reducing the permitting barriers. Every step is what allows project delivery and ultimately to get that end-to-end supply chain that delivers that abundant energy that brings down prices. Congresswoman Miller, I just wanted to turn to you because this is the MVP. It is near and dear to your state and your district.
Wow.
I just want to give you a few chances to say a few words about that.
Well, you were making me excited, and then you made me sad. But I'm thrilled. They're hiring. Things are going on. It is moving. I'm so grateful for all the hard work that everybody did to get this through. And I was directly in conversation, so to speak, with what was going on at the time. And man, it made so many people's day when we actually got that through. But there's so many things that go through our minds when you're having these discussions, and nobody's mentioned the word China, and nobody has mentioned the fact that whatever we mine, whatever we produce, we have so many more safety regulations. The people that are mining minerals in other countries don't have the same requirements or safety that we do here. And I mean, that even goes into the medicine that's, we could have this conversation for a week, yes. But as a country, we have China out there, and we have to be very aware that everything they do costs a whole lot less money than what we do here, because we want to make sure our people are safe. So, I am thrilled with what's gone on with Mountain Valley. I am just so happy, because it is a beginning, and everything that we're doing in our Congress at this point, we are strategically and carefully trying to move things forward for our energy.
Well, between the Lower Energy Costs Act and MVP authorization, I think the early returns from the new Republican House Representatives, very, very positive in the energy space. I do want to bring up, just step back for a second, and discuss natural gas specifically, because we are here in the heart of the Marcellus and Utica Shale. Despite facing all these regulatory and permitting kind of headwinds, Appalachia is an energy powerhouse. That's West Virginia, that's Ohio, that's Pennsylvania. The resource in place is tremendous. The location proximate to demand centers is tremendous. Really, all the capital is there. If you remove some of these burdens, and even with the burdens there's an impressive amount of capital that people are willing to deploy for these projects. I would just like to hear from all three of you. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of this resource and the natural gas industry, to your districts, and John, to your members, and really what the potential of this is, even be above and beyond if we remove some of these regulatory and permitting headwinds?
I'd be glad to go first on this one. So we're talking about the Appalachian Basin, right? So the Marcellus Shale is without a doubt one of the most prolific plays in North America. If you talk about perspectives of recent years, in 2021, the Appalachian Basin was producing 31.7 billion cubic feet per day. And to put that into perspective, that is over 7 billion cubic feet per day more than the Permian and the Haynesville plays combined, which are number two.
Say that loudly, because we never hear it that way.
This is just for you. So I'm not. You really want me to repeat it?
We're all friends. We all know. Yeah.
And so obviously Permian and Haynesville are second and third respectively, at least in 2021. But that figure there is 38% of U.S. production. So when you talk about ability, and you talk about not only from an acreage but a reserve standpoint, we have the ability. We have the ability to be energy independent, and if you look at the statistics, the Appalachian would play a vast majority part of that in America. From a revenue standpoint, in PA alone, that's 80 billion producing from that. PA itself, if PA was a country, if Pennsylvania was a country, it'd be the fourth largest producing country in the world.
And you're not mentioning Utica or Rogersville.
We haven't even addressed any of that. So that's where, when you talk about that reserve opportunity, you're talking about the ability of one region to basically power the entire nation. Without a hurricane.
Yeah, right.
Without a tornado. Every once in a while.
But you need the infrastructure, and
Correct.
It's been mentioned a couple times, litigation. John, you mentioned the ACP, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was part of this original, comprehensive vision for the Mountain Valley. And I think many people don't realize that you can spend, as a project developer or a project proponent, 4, 5, 6 years trying to get a permit, not just one permit, but multiple permits that have multiple environmental reviews tied to that. But then you got to go defend it in many cases in court. In the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, they actually defended it up to the Supreme Court and won.
Yeah.
And then 2 months later, the developer comes out and says, well, things have changed and the economics have changed and we can't finish it now because the project had basically been bled dry.
Well, and that goes back to the permitting issues. Just because a project hasn't broken ground doesn't mean it doesn't cost money. That's where the majority of the money, the money spent for the project is allocated. That's known. You're talking about money that no one knows how much you're going to spend. You look at a project like MVP that had an original cost of $2.5 billion. What are they publishing now? 6.6? Where did that other $4 billion came from? It came from sitting. It came from lawsuits. It came from restoration, because God forbid they had any more environmental issues to give more fuel to the fire. That's the problem. If you spend money up front on an aging infrastructure, you can't spend it to fix the infrastructure.
If California and New York want to get rid of gas stoves, go ahead.
I think they want to.
They do?
Yeah, well, they've made it clear, actually. But stay away from us. Leave us alone.
It was pizza ovens this
we,
morning.
We got this. And what's incredible, and this is where you see that it's political, is how come at one time, when you were talking about fossil fuels, the message was, nothing wrong with gas. Nothing wrong with gas. Go ahead with gas. Then all of a sudden, okay, we got an abundance of gas, and now that's a problem too. For them. It shouldn't be. The opportunity, we saw it. I mean, everything was booming. And the technologies that we have to be able to capture, again, this God-given natural resource to enable us as a country to take care of ourselves. It's really kind of incredible, but supply chain, domestic supply chain. Carol hinted at it. Let me just tell you something if you don't know already. If China cuts off the ingredients or the manufacturing of generic medications that they have cornered the market in for the world, if they cut it off, our shelves are empty in 2 months. My daughter needed amoxicillin for an ear infection. It wasn't even available. I can tell you as a doctor, that was never the case. We are at a dangerous time right now. And so we have got to bring back generic manufacturing to the United States, but all the ingredients that go into it, we have to be able to permit the mining, etc., that can make these products. We are at great risk right now. We are not an independent nation. We're coming up on the 4th of July. We are not an independent nation. We are a very dependent nation, unfortunately. And again, you talk about the Ways and Means Committee. They had a hearing on the effects of climate change on our health. Well, I can tell you the effects of a lack of energy on our health. And when that grid goes down, Puerto Rico, I went down to visit Centro Medico, their main hospital there, and the VA down there after 2 hurricanes. It's all generators. I served a year in Iraq. It's all generators to run our combat support hospital. That hasn't changed. We don't have other options right now. So why are we harming ourselves over and over and over again, and China laughs all the way through it?
That's the old cutting off your nose to spite your face logic.
There is an element to that of all of this forced energy transition. Congressman Wenstrup, you bring up a really important and concerning point, which is that of energy reliability. Right? At some point, it gets so expensive that you can't afford it on a consistent basis. And when you move from transportation fuel, which is price at the pump, to the electrical grid, which is run by utilities and these kind of quasi-governmental agencies at the federal level, you have even less control of it. The question is, when you go to flip the switch, will the electricity go on? Mm-hmm. Right? And that will be the same for everybody, whether they're rich or whether they're poor. And so, I just want to highlight both of your districts and states are part of a regional electricity grid and market known as PJM. PJM covers 7 states. and portions of 5 others. Last year, the federal entity that oversees this regional grid issued a report warning that grid reliability is at risk, in essence because there's a shortage of dependable baseload power generation facilities serving this regional market. And as, let's say, coal gets taken offline by various regulatory policies, not enough natural gas is coming online to replace it. Nuclear is one possible solution, but nuclear faces even higher hurdles in many ways. And renewables simply cannot serve the same purpose as baseload dispatchable generation. No matter how many kind of subsidies are thrown at it or cronyism that the federal government engages in. Now the EPA has proposed new regulations for power plant emissions. This was earlier this month. And there's a good chance that they will finalize these regulations next summer. And they're specifically designed to accelerate this trend of pushing out reliable generation. So, that's a long lead-in, but I guess my question is, is it legitimate and should Americans be worried that unless we have a sharp U-turn, by this administration and, in the Senate in terms of maybe taking up the Lower Energy Costs Act, that something as basic as flipping the switch and having electricity on demand, that could be in jeopardy?
Well, Shelley and I are both on a bill. I mean, in both houses, we are saying, stop that, stop it. We're not ready to do that. And we have to look at, what is it? Energy is national security. We have to look at how we support our grid and the best way to do it. And it isn't just by chopping off your head. So more of that has to happen on both sides of the house. It has to be bicameral to make sure that we take care of that grid.
Yeah, if we were a country that at every level made the top priority having a reliable energy source to supply the country, then we'd be better off. But the problem right now is the priority is renewable only as the goal, rather than the goal of constantly having a reliable source. Maybe someday that will be all renewable, who knows? But having the reliable source should be the number one priority. The effects of not having that are tremendous. And you look at California, they have their power downtimes now, because of the policies that they have in place. It's not necessary if we're doing things right. And it doesn't mean we're destroying the planet or each other. But, I pointed out before, maybe we're doing too much sometimes and actually causing more harm than good. Again, going back to when Ways and Means, when we didn't have control, when they had a hearing on the effects of climate change on our health. Well, I talk about our health when we don't have a reliable energy source. I remember being in Chicago about 25 years ago at a Cubs game. It was so hot that there was a guy, in the back of the bleachers with a hose, and people just lined up to get hosed down because it was so hot. I don't know how the players made it through the game, but they had brownouts. I mean, the city was shutting down. 500 people died in their homes because they didn't have air conditioning. That's an effect on your health. And you can't just look at it in one way without seeing the damage that you do on people's lives. Because energy does bring good things to life in a lot of ways. The old General Electric, I think that was their slogan, we bring good things to life. Electricity does bring good things to life. We can always work on trying to do it smarter, better, but let's make sure we are doing it smarter and better in the big picture. You got to have more than one commentary at the table.
Wasn't that young man that just recently died was a power worker who had gone down to help with the hurricanes, and he died from overexposure to heat, was what I understood.
Is that right?
Yes. And I have a problem with calling it renewable energy. What's renewable about it? I think it's alternative energy. Mm-hmm. And we just need to be smarter and with all of the above as we move forward to power our country. We do not want to be dependent upon China, and we're finding that across the board. We both serve on the health subcommittee, And when you talk about the medicines and the things that we need to do to help near shore, if we can't even bring it all back here, and it's the same, the energy that's going on. Even I just got back from Guyana, and they have this huge oil exploration going on there, and Kelly Armstrong likened it to what happened in North Dakota years ago. So the natural resources that we have from our earth are so incredible that we just need to be as good as we possibly can be to harvest them to keep us all healthy.
Yeah. So from a worry standpoint, I think 100% it's a legitimate concern, and everybody needs to be concerned about it. The concept of fully getting rid of oil and gas is just, it's not, there's no basis to it. I'd like someone, find one thing in this building that doesn't require or rely on a petroleum product. Just one. You won't, because the average American has about 6,000 daily household products that they use that require petroleum. So to get rid of it is, frankly, just illogical. The problem that you have with doing so is if you continue to restrict it to a point where it's not economical to extract, it's not going to get extracted. However, the demand's not going to go away. Our population isn't going to go backwards. There's nobody that's going to stop getting on the phone. There's nobody that's going to stop driving. There's a lot of people that like to talk about who needs to do it, but they don't actually do it. So the problem with removing the demand and our ability to do it, or not removing the demand, removing the ability rather, the demand stays. So where's it going to come from?
Well,
and going back, it's going to come from countries that don't have the same regulations, which is actually worse for the environment.
that's what I was just going to say. What about India's population?
Right.
We just had their prime minister. They have 4 times as many. I mean, granted, our population isn't growing because in the 70s when they were saying we should have 2 children, in China they were saying you should have 1 child. India's population is bursting at the seams, and how are we going to produce? Are we going to produce the energy? Are they going to be producing it? It's just that's your whole point right there.
Well, and look how they're establishing themselves to be an energy powerhouse. Everybody else is doing it except us. And again, alternative energy is fine. It can be there, but ask ERCOT how that's going right now. It's not going very well.
ERCOT being the Texas grid,
right.
which leads the nation in, I think, overall renewable, quote-unquote, renewable energy,
Right.
particularly wind.
Right now they're getting about 3%. Natural gas is taken, it's somewhere around 70% is being driven. And there's still risk. They're still getting to critical levels on a daily basis. And you see the powerhouse continual day after day that is still there. You couldn't even build an alternative energy infrastructure without oil and gas. You couldn't do it. You couldn't power it. You couldn't build it.
That's right.
You're talking about something that builds energy. Let's talk medical. You can power a defibrillator with electric, but you can't make it.
Right.
So the concept of getting rid of it is just illogical. It cannot happen. It still needs to be there. And going back to it, if you make it economical to extract, it's not going to get extracted. Somebody's gonna, but it's not going to be here. And then we are completely dependent, as you said.
And did I hear the windmills are killing whales?
You sure did.
Killing
Whales.
Whales.
Oh, whales. Oh, yes, offshore. Yes, yes.
There's some talk around that.
I mean, there's so many important aspects of this energy conversation. We've really just been able to scratch the surface. John, you mentioned without energy you can't build out renewables. You also without oil and gas you can't build out renewables. You also can't build them out without permitting reform.
Right.
Which is why you kind of find, let's say, the environmental movement or states like California kind of in this double bind all of a sudden, where we want to move away from this, then they realize that the energy source that they think they can rely on and want to move towards depends on building things, and many of the barriers that have been erected for fossil fuels are now standing in the way of that build out as well.
You brought up nuclear, and just to touch on that, the average time that it takes to build a nuclear power plant today is 15 years. So without permitting reform, you're never going to get to a nuclear
Which means they
reliability.
typically don't get built.
Right.
Those are just the ones that get
That's
built.
one of the reasons why there's a lot of reasons, that it has been leaned away from, but it can produce energy. It can be a reliable source. But we're just going to wait 15 years. What's the plan now? If you want to talk about, you talked about coal too. Homer City, largest coal generation plant in Pennsylvania, is now closed. What is backing that up today? Nothing. You're relying on an existing grid to increase exponentially to take over something. It's illogical.
In Renovo, Pennsylvania, there was a $1 billion natural gas electricity generation facility, basically a power plant that they abandoned the project just last month because of litigation of their Clean Air Act permit. And so it was a tremendous investment. It would have been located in an abandoned rail yard. It would have been great in terms of renewing the community. There's tax base, there's jobs. It would help the PJM grid, right, with its reliability. And it's also interesting how when you get in these regional markets, state policies as well as federal really impact other states in the market, and that's a piece that we can't even get into.
So I got something to share on that front. Pike County, Ohio, very near here, had the facility, a nuclear facility built in the 1950s. It really helped win the Cold War. This place was unbelievable, the size of this. It was built in 2 years. It's an amazing accomplishment for America at the time. And it just got 40 years to break it down now and get rid of it. But the whole concept through this whole process of breaking it down is bring something else in. We've got to rejuvenate this area. We can't just have this be a brownfield, et cetera. So that's been what we've been fighting for all along. But you talk about attitudes. So when I first started in Congress, engaging out there, a project that's been going on a long time is the cleaning up project. But I meet with 3 county commissioners from Pike County, all Democrats, and they all say to me, we'll take nuclear if we can get it to replace it. I mean, they've got the infrastructure right there to be part of this energy capital of the world right here. And I said, well, you must be the only county in America where you got 3 Democrat county commissioners saying, we'll take nuclear, if we can get it. But to your point, regionally, this is the attitude too, that, we're not into all that. We want to do energy. This is what we know in this area. And we have all this processes available to us. We're right near the natural gas, and just so much more that we can do. And we got to keep promoting it that way. And so we are trying to replenish that area, that property. They have Centrus there, which is the only domestic source of enriched uranium, which we use for our nuclear subs. So there's a lot of possibilities
You
here.
hiked it?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really hate to bring this panel discussion to a close because it's just been so insightful. But I think we've come away with a bunch of really useful takeaways. Number 1, we live in an energy-hungry world. Number 2, America, and in particular this region, is really well positioned to capitalize if we can remove some of the regulatory and permitting barriers that are getting in the way of innovation, of deployment, of scalability, of infrastructure and other solutions. And really the private sector is the one that is best positioned to provide those solutions at the lowest cost. There is a place and a fit for every energy source in our energy mix, but really we need to let consumers in the private sector make those decisions rather than it being forced down on us by government. So thank you, esteemed panelists, and now I would like to open it up to the Q&A for all of the wonderful business leaders we have in the room. Yes.
Thank you. I had a question. Since you folks have to sit in those endless committee meetings with people that don't necessarily feel the same way as you do, maybe you can help us understand. You kind of alluded to this earlier, Congresswoman Miller, that everything around us, everything from the fibers on our clothing, everything we touch, comes from the molecules from hydrocarbons. They don't come from the voltage from a solar panel. And even if you had a magic solar panel that wasn't made by slave labor in China, that, you know, that was made out of unicorns, I guess, that produced all
Horns,
the
they're
electricity
horns.
we could use. We still need the molecules to make all the things that we touch. Where do these folks think that the tires that their Tesla or their Prius, where do they think the blacktop pavement is going to come from that they're going to drive their Prius on? Where do they think this stuff is going to come from?
And just for the
Unicorns.
That's
benefit
my
of,
question.
just for the
Unicorns.
benefit of those not
Jimmy
in the room.
Stewart, Concerned Citizen.
Yes,
That's-
thank you.
President of Ohio Gas Association.
There is no answer to that. If you looked around the room and somebody waved a magic wand that took away everybody's clothes that were made with some kind of hydrocarbon, I mean, now, yes, we do still have cotton. We still can shear sheep. We could use silkworms. But when you start realizing, like, I hear from clothing manufacturers that they have to buy their spandex in China. I mean, it all goes back, it all weaves together, but most of us would be sitting here and not a lot of clothes. Or if you've had any heart, you know, what would you call those things that, you know, any of the surgeries that you've had to do. So much of that is done, you know, with hydrocarbon,
The stents.
the stent, thank you,
Yes.
the stents. I was just trying to think of all the things that you've done, even medically.
Oh, very much so. My answer to that is that's just ignored.
Just pretend.
Just
Yeah,
ignored.
it's
We can sit there and
unicorns.
make that case, and it's just blank stares. And you know, I'll just be blunt. They're getting their C-SPAN moment. And if you in those 5 minutes, and this is where roundtables do better. And I alluded to that before, where the one guy came to me and said, we probably should sit and talk about some of these things. I said, yeah, but let's do it in a round table, not when the cameras are rolling on C-SPAN and you know you're
Making
preaching to
points.
people that have made this a religion rather than a science. And when you make something a religion rather than a science, then you take away common sense. And you ignore certain things because you don't have to explain it, because it's now, that's just the way it is. And you don't hear other things. And I'm just being very honest with you. We see this time and time again. I can tell you, like, when I was chair in health on VA, we got the Mission Act done, which no one thought we could get done in a bipartisan fashion, which allowed for veterans to go outside the VA for care. We did it because we had round tables with all the people at the table. You would be at the table. The other side would be at the table. You have these conversations around a table, and it was Republicans and Democrats and you know the veteran service organizations and VA itself, and we got this thing done. And everyone on both sides of the aisle endorsed that bill. I'm not saying on this topic we could get everyone on both sides of the aisle behind common sense, but we would have the conversations. But right now, the way it's done in the hearings, to answer your question, they just ignore what we have to say, or even what experts might have to say. And then they get their 5 minutes and just go into why this has to be done, because there's a group out there that votes for them with the same approach.
Hypocrisy doesn't require a lot of thought.
I think we have time for at least one more question.
Yeah, I'm Mary Beth Anderson. I work for Antero Resources, 2 rigs this morning in Tyler County, 1 rig in Noble County. I'm the president of the board of directors of the Gas and Oil Association of West Virginia. My question's about permit reform, but just give me a minute to tell, and I'll a little bit more perspective and reaction to what I've heard. Thank you so much for your comments about common sense and balance. I kind of almost wonder if there is a change in the tide, optimistically, related to common sense and balance. I mean, we had the Mountain Valley Pipeline decision last week. The EPA had a decision related to Sackett, waters of the United States, related to EPA overreach on wetlands. And then you think about, Russia invading Ukraine and people asking, Mary Beth, there's 10 rigs in West Virginia this morning. Can you do 20? Well, maybe. I mean, you've got your labor problems, you've got your supply chain. The problem is you bring in 10 more rigs, what do you do with the gas? You can't move it, right? Then you shut in wells because you can't move it around the state. You can't move it to the Mid-Atlantic. So the problem about pipeline is not just about building pipelines. It's about you can't produce the gas, right? You can't move it around if you can't move it. So you see these things and you see, okay, natural gas coming in on Russian LNG, Russian tankers to Boston, so that New England. I mean, you see these things happening and you think, gosh, maybe there is a tide that might shift. So my question is about permit reform and taking these things into consideration and wondering, something that is helpful is, like you said, renewables need permit reform too. So that's helpful for permit reform. The thing that might not be helpful is the debt relief package had some permit reform elements in it, so does that slow the progress? Just inside baseball, do you think permit reform, how would you handicap all those things?
Well, what if you couldn't produce a solar panel unless everything in it was 100% domestic?
Made in America.
More organic.
I mean, really, you got to recognize that you have to admit the problem and the concern first. But I would agree with you. I've been surprised what we got in the debt ceiling bill. I was surprised.
They worked hard. They worked hard.
They worked really hard, but I really thought that even the president would be willing to shut down the government and default rather than do some of those things. So maybe the tide is turning a little bit. Maybe, it all comes down to what America understands and gets. And when their power's out, they get it. When you can't get baby formula, you get it.
That's still
Right?
a problem.
Yeah, well, that's because our WIC program made it so that only one brand was really going to be able to provide it. And when that one brand is shut down, then you don't have it. Because we took competition out of it. That's in the same vein of what we're talking about.
There is an aspect about a lot of this forced energy transition that's sort of head in the sand. And with everything that's going on around us right now, it does seem like maybe people are starting or being forced to pick their heads up out of the sand and face some of the realities, which luckily we can face because we have a lot of great solutions in the private sector and with our domestic resources, to tackle them. We have come to the end, unfortunately, of this great event. Thank you to our panelists, Congresswoman Miller, Congressman Wenstrup, and John Gallo for joining us. Thank you to Steptoe and Johnson PLLC for hosting us. And I think this event has reminded everybody that prosperity is possible with the right policy solutions and champions. And we will be closely following this area of policy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.